video is part 3 of a 5-part series in which I examined Shadow Weaver's arc with a critical eye. If you have not seen the previous 2 parts, they're very important to understanding my full analysis. Also, as I have mentioned before, the series delves into topics of suicidality and abuse because the show itself deals heavily with this topic. If you are in danger of taking your own life, please call this number and tell them what's going on. You need to take care of yourself. Alright, on with the video! In this part, I'm going to be covering seasons 3 and 4 together. This is because Shadow Weaver's arc kind of, slows down, basically, from here on out. When I get to season 4, I'm not going to be doing as much of a scene-by-scene breakdown, but rather a meta-commentary on the problems I have. Season 4 is when the show started to take a less stellar turn for me with Shadow Weaver's arc, and I'm going to be discussing that today. But for now, let's delve into season 3 of the show, where what I considered heavy foreshadowing for redemption took place. Season 3 opens with Shadow Weaver standing over Adora's bed, gazing down at her. Adora wakes up, but shortly after, Shadow Weaver passes out on the floor and is imprisoned shortly after. What follows is a sequence of Adora trying to reach her because she wants to know why Shadow Weaver came to Bright Moon of all places when she escaped prison. Her friends try to stop her, saying that it's a bad idea to let Adora talk to the woman who abused her, but Adora doesn't necessarily agree with this. Eventually, a crucial and pivotal conversation happens. Adora tells them she needs to talk to Shadow Weaver, and Glimmer protests by saying that Shadow Weaver will try to hurt Adora again, that she's evil and evil people don't change. Adora says that she was from the Horde and she changed, and she has to believe that Shadow Weaver can change too. Her friends slowly begin to see her point, and they go to distract Castaspella and Angela while Adora and Glimmer sneak in. I'm going to make the full case that this episode screams redemption later on, but this scene is very important to that equation in my opinion. Many people have tried to argue that Adora only visited Shadow Weaver because she has an unhealthy attachment to her as a victim, and that her willingness to give her mother figure another chance is a sign that she's still under her control. But to this I say, you are dead wrong. If you remember, in Season 5, Adora was willing to risk her neck for Catra too, even going so far as to rescue her from the Horde Prime's ship. By this logic, you would have to say that Adora had an unhealthy attachment to Catra too. And no, it's not different just because Catra did one good thing. If we're going to argue that one good deed in the end doesn't redeem Shadow Weaver, something that I agree with, the same applies to Catra. Yet Adora showed mercy to both of them even when they quite frankly didn't deserve it. It's also true that Adora wasn't sure if Catra had truly changed, the same as Shadow Weaver. The situations are frighteningly similar, so I don't think the argument of Adora is unhealthily attached holds much water when you examine it closely. In the next scene, Adora and Glimmer enter Shadow Weaver's prison room, seeing her there. Glimmer threatens Shadow Weaver, but Adora asks her to stop, yet Glimmer remains in the room the whole time to protect Adora. This is more evidence that the situation is not as unhealthy as some people claim. Shadow Weaver tries to manipulate Adora, but Adora doesn't take any of the bait, not a single bit. Eventually, Shadow Weaver reveals that she's dying, something that turns out to be very true, and Adora begins to panic. She transforms into She-Ra, making a deal with Shadow Weaver. She'll heal her, and Shadow Weaver will tell the rebellion all she knows. Glimmer protests that Adora doesn't know how to heal, and Shadow Weaver suggests that she can help. She used to teach magic and train Glimmer's father. Shadow Weaver agrees to the deal, and their training begins. Shadow Weaver tells Adora to concentrate and focus her power, but Adora gets frustrated and upset, saying that she doesn't know how to heal and she's tried everything. Shadow Weaver tells her to come close and let her help, a risk that Adora reluctantly takes. Shadow Weaver then proceeds to pick apart Adora's psychology, telling her that she's afraid she won't be able to heal and her power will only hurt people instead, essentially that she won't be strong enough to save. She gives Adora the advice to let herself feel it, then move past it, and that she is greater than her fear. Adora is then able to heal her, and Queen Angela bursts into the room angrily, demanding to know what happened. It's here that I'm going to make the case that Season 3 clearly, undeniably sets up redemption for Shadow Weaver. Not just the cheap redemption by death ending she later got, but a real, living redemption. The first thing to consider is that Adora sets up the idea that she can change, something that is already a given, but that the fandom doesn't seem to accept despite bending head over heels about it for Catra, but that's a discussion for another day. Secondly, Adora heals Shadow Weaver in spite of her mother figure's manipulation. She doesn't do it when Shadow Weaver is quote-unquote good enough to quote-unquote deserve it. She does it because in spite of everything, she loves her. Thirdly, the obvious. Shadow Weaver lives. If the writers didn't want to set up a full living redemption for her, they should not have brought her back to life only to kill her off later. This sets up the idea that Shadow Weaver's arc is essentially her realizing she doesn't deserve to live anymore and acting accordingly, which is one of the most disgusting messages I think I have ever seen, but we'll save that for part 4. Finally, I'm not saying that Shadow Weaver is redeemed at this present moment, just that it's set up very heavily, especially given that Micah's return is foreshadowed later in this season, and many people, myself included, thought he could act as a potential support group for her. In conclusion, I strongly believe that this season officially boxes her into a living redemption, and that any other ending would not have worked with what the show itself presented to us. I'm going to skip Moment of Truth because while it is a Shadow Weaver heavy episode, it doesn't offer much in the way of character development. So now we come to Season 4. Because this season obviously doesn't have much in the way of character development either, I'm going to be doing a bit of a meta commentary on several problems I had with the way it presented and handled Shadow Weaver. But let's get one thing out of the way first. Shadow Weaver is hilarious as heck in this season. This is by far the funniest season for her, and because of that, I can almost forgive the issues that I have with her arc. They utilize dry humor with her in one of the most well-delivered ways I have ever seen, which is a feat considering that I am autistic and thus I either don't understand or don't laugh at many common forms of humor. But unfortunately, there are also a lot of problems with this season. I think the most major one is how the season handles her relationship with Glimmer. Briefly, I'll summarize and say that Shadow Weaver eventually takes Glimmer under her wing to teach her sorcery so she'll be even more powerful than her parents. The only thing I have to comment on before I go on my batching session is that I don't agree with the people who say Shadow Weaver secretly was planning to betray the rebellion. Regardless of your view on how she treated Glimmer, her motive was to stop the Horde, if on her own terms, which are not particularly good. But anyway, my biggest problem with Season 4, as I mentioned before, is Shadow Weaver's relationship with Glimmer. Namely, that the show clearly wants us to think that Shadow Weaver was manipulating Glimmer. Seeing as how Shadow Weaver has not been redeemed yet, I would not have a single problem with this idea if it had been set up correctly. But set it up correctly, they did not. The show doesn't offer enough screen time of their relationship to really say one way or the other whether Shadow Weaver manipulated Glimmer, and I have equal issues with people who say Shadow Weaver was grooming Glimmer the whole time, as I do with people who say there's no grooming whatsoever. Why? Because we just don't know. Each side is going to argue that their opinion is obvious, so let's talk about why I disagree with both of them. Those who say that Shadow Weaver is the reason Glimmer had her fall in Season 4 ignore two things. First, Glimmer is not a helpless child like Adora and Catra were, but a teenager who knew that Shadow Weaver was a manipulative jerkwad. Second, Glimmer had already displayed dark tendencies in previous seasons. Are we seriously going to forget that Glimmer had planned to pummel Catra, or that she was ready to punch Shadow Weaver in the face when the woman was dying on the floor? Glimmer has a track record of impulsivity and violence that predated Shadow Weaver's influence, and clearly got worse after her mother sacrificed herself. So don't tell me that Shadow Weaver was entirely responsible. But I'm not letting what I'll call the anti-man squad, anti-manipulation, you know what, forget it, off the hook either. In the finale, Shadow Weaver clearly does attempt manipulation on Glimmer, trying to keep her away from the Fright Zone. The reasons for her doing this are partially unclear, but it is clear that she is trying to bond to Glimmer too quickly to get her to obey, right down to the physical affection in the famous manipulation tone. Thus, I don't feel comfortable saying one way or the other that Shadow Weaver's relationship with Glimmer was or wasn't characterized by manipulation. All we know is that Glimmer herself chose the darkness, and Shadow Weaver played some sort of unknown role in this. This decision to keep it ambiguous is a huge problem to me. I mentioned in the last part of this series that the writers do this weird thing where they purposely leave huge chunks of Shadow Weaver's story ambiguous so that both sides have validation of their opinions. This is the first time, however, that I would say the entire season is characterized by this ambiguity. If you are writing a villain who is supposed to be a certain archetype, you have to take a firm stance on it in the story and commit to the archetype. If Shadow Weaver is supposed to be sympathetic, you have to continue her arc of redemption through season 4. If she's supposed to be a complex but unsympathetic character, make it clear and undeniable that she manipulated both Micah and Glimmer. But despite what the showrunner has said, neither of these so-called cases are made clear, like with Catra and Adora. This opens them up to their foolish ending for her, so they're able to tell the people who read her as sympathetic, like me, that we were never aligned with the author's intent and thus shouldn't complain. I'm not saying that Noelle has accused us Shadow Weaver lovers of this. In fact, she's very tolerant of our opinions, it seems, but they are still in a position to claim that through this strange ambiguity. There's only one more scene I want to touch on with Season 4 before we wrap up for today, and that's Micah's return. When Micah comes back, he's weakened from his injury on Beast Island. He sees Shadow Weaver sitting on Glimmer's throne and throws a spell at her, kind of panicking in a way, but she's able to break it. Her voice is full of emotion as she realizes he survived, and it's very, very clear that she still cares for him in spite of everything. She also doesn't strike back when, again, she would have everything to gain from it. Unfortunately, this scene is never really relevant to Season 5, but it did look a lot like more setup to the redemption arc. I know that this was a shorter part compared to the others, but trust me, once we get to Season 5, my video will not disappoint in terms of length. What did you think about Seasons 3 and 4? Did you think that Shadow Weaver's redemption arc was set up clearly, or do you think I'm totally wrong in letting my love for Shadow Weaver cloud my perception of her arc? What about her relationship with Glimmer? I would love to hear your thoughts. But with that being said, that's where I'm going to end today's video. I'll be back with an analysis of Season 5 next week. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.